Do you know what it means when you see a white owl in the REZ? Depending on what tribe or REZ you're in, when it comes to the white owl, it can mean death, or some other kind of different meaning. Sometimes they're messengers. They bring messages from the other side. There's even been stories about how when people see one, someone close to them passes away. I even heard about how they're not evil, but more like messengers about an illness or a death that is coming. So basically people end up connecting the owl with it being evil. Well, I'm not here to talk about the messengers, but it somewhat ties in with the story. Even now that I'm writing this out, a lot of it makes sense. When I was a kid, I used to walk around the summer nights. I would tell my mom and dad what I was doing. Mom always said it was fine, and dad always said to be careful. I would go out and about till midnight. I have described the Pine Ridge before in my stories, at least over here where I'm at. Some cedar and down by the creek that flows through the whole community. There's oak, elm, and cottonwood trees along the dry creek beds that seem to be everywhere. On one night, I was making my walk in the dark. It's peaceful to walk under the stars and moon. Then I made it home to find my dad sitting on the front porch. The dogs were barking and I asked him what he was doing. He then said in a stern voice, "Waiting for you." Shit. I thought I was in trouble, but he just got up and went inside. Out here in the REZ, when dogs start barking at night, you better pay attention. They're picking up on something that we can't see. Something moving around out there. And at night, you know if the dogs are barking, it's for a good reason. If you lived out here on the REZ, you know that barking isn't just noise. Because if all of a sudden they stop and everything goes quiet, that silence can feel even scarier than the noise. It makes you wonder what made them stop and what's still out there. Anyways, I woke up and did some things around the house. When the evening time rolled around and I was getting ready to do another walk in the dark, as I was going outside, my dad was sitting out there again. The dogs up and down the creek were going crazy as well, barking like they were scared. I was ready to go when my dad told me to sit down a minute before I left. I could see that he wanted to talk about something, but I could tell he was trying his best to figure out how. He told me right off that he didn't like me walking around late at night by myself. Before I could ask him why, he told me a story. And I'm not sure about you, but when your elders speak, you listen. My dad started talking about when he was a teenager like I was at that time. He would get his horse, saddle up after the chores were done, and go visit his friends late into the night. That was how he spent his summer evenings. One night he was on his way home. It was late. The full moon was just rising in the east. It was about 1/4 of a mile from when his horse stopped on its own and started staring into a dry creek bed. He sat up on his horse and looked down into the dry creek bed trying to make out what his horse was looking at. His horse snorted and did a little hop. He got his horse under control. It was still looking into the dry creek bed. My dad thought he saw something moving, but he wasn't sure what it was. It was white, and it seemed to be moving in the trees below. He continued watching, when all of a sudden it jumped up into the air and came towards him. It did scare the horse. It took a few quick steps to the side. He reined it in while the white thing came at him. It was a bit unnerving, so he relaxed his grip on the reins and let the horse go. He got about 20 feet when the white object came out of the dry creek bed behind him. He looked at it as it came closer, and it was a huge white owl, flying. Something about it scared him off, so he took off. It flew behind him as he rode his horse. Eventually it flew over him. It was a pretty big owl, he said. The wingspan was as long as his horse was from tail to nose, and the body looked like about 3 feet long. Dad said it flew off, directly towards the moon, and eventually it disappeared. He just sat on his horse as it was flying away. Once the weird feeling wore off, he continued back home. Home was at the bottom of the hill, surrounded by the creek on the north and west. To the south were pine-covered hills, a dry creek bed to the east, and a big alfalfa field that was fenced off. He got to the top of the hill and then his horse already snorted, jumped sideways, while looking towards the alfalfa field. The moon was slowly coming up, but all he could see was deep shadows in the field along with the haystacks that were there as well. He couldn't see anything but thought it was deer running around that was causing his horse to spook. He looked in the same direction that the horse was looking at. When it snorted, and it jumped again, he grabbed on with his knees, looking towards where the horse was looking. In the slowly rising moonlight, he could see something laying on top of the haystack. A slight breeze from the south came and his horse snorted again, and then it took off towards the house. He just held on to the reins and let the horse go. It slowed down long enough for him to get off, and then it took off behind the house. He went inside. His mom asked him what was going on, and he told her what happened and what he saw in the field. As he was telling my grandma what he saw, he said the dog started barking like crazy. He said this just made the whole situation worse. That's when she called for my grandpa. He came out of the bedroom, and she told him what happened to my dad. Grandpa got out his gun when he heard about the figure lying on the haystack. He told my grandma and dad to stay inside while he went to see what was going on, and then he walked outside. The moonlight was brighter now as he walked out of the house and down to the fence line for the alfalfa field. He opened the gate and started walking out into the field, looking around at the haystacks that were closest to the house. The 4 haystacks that were directly south of the house were clear from what he could see in the moonlight. Grandpa started walking towards the 2 haystacks that were northeast of the house along the dry creek bed. The first haystack he didn't see anything, but as he got within 50 yards of the second haystack, he thought he saw something peeking over the top but slowly sliding down. Kinda like when you peek over something but slowly bring your head back down. Grandpa focused on the haystack, watching in from the open field around it. Then he saw it again. Somebody's head in the shadows, slowly peeking over the top at him. He then spoke to the shadow head, telling him to come down off the haystack. The head disappeared, and when he said that, Grandpa spoke in a louder voice, telling whoever it was to come off the haystack as he brought the gun up to his waist. He started walking towards the haystack, repeating that whoever that was had to get down off the haystack. He could see movement in the shadows. Whoever it was sliding off backwards, putting the haystack between them and my grandpa. At this point, Grandpa took off in a fast run towards the back of the haystack. He came around the right side of the haystack in time to see who it was. Standing before him was a man-like hairy creature that stood there as he came around the haystack. He could see the dark hair all over its body that sort of glistened in the moonlight. Standing there watching him, he then brought the rifle to his shoulder but stopped, lowering it down to his waist. It was taller than my grandpa. It was about 7 feet tall. Grandpa stood there watching as it slowly turned around, staring back at the gun as it slowly walked off. Grandpa continued watching as it went up the hill towards the road. He followed behind it at about 40 yards. When it got to the top of the hill, it took off in a fast walk towards the road. When this thing got to the top of the hill, it took off in a fast walk towards the road. When Grandpa got to the top of the hill, he could see it already by the road. It was now moving really fast up the pine-covered hills north of the house. When Grandpa couldn't see it anymore, he walked back to the house. My grandma and dad asked what happened, and he just told them it was a drunk guy trying to pass out, but he left. That did help calm my grandma down, and then they went to bed. A few days later, Grandpa told my dad what really happened, and he told him to be careful if he was coming home after dark. I got shivers sent down my spine as my dad was telling me these things. He told me that I needed to be extra careful because the dogs had been barking. As a matter of fact, he said with a serious look, "It's better to just stay inside once it gets dark. The dogs have been barking, and that's not without reason." I knew he was saying to stay inside now. I then asked him about the white owl that he saw that night, and if this must have been the creature that he saw. He sighed, looking into the landscape. Owls are not just birds, son. They're messengers. That's what the elders always told us too. They bring warnings, messages from the spirit side. It wasn't just crossing my path by any chance. I know it was a sign, maybe a warning about what I encountered later that night. Sometimes they warn us of illness or death. Other times they're just letting us know to be cautious. But that night, with that thing on the haystack, I'm pretty sure the owl knew. It knew that something wasn't right. It's all connected, son, don't you see? These signs, these warnings, we have to pay attention to them. Of course, not out of fear, but out of respect. Things don't just happen for any reason. This morning, while you were still asleep, I went around the house and prayed. I then saw an owl right outside your window, and seeing an owl like that, again, it's not something that we should ignore. My dad then got up and told me to follow him. We went to the side of the house, right outside my bedroom window, and he said, we need to be more careful in the next coming days and weeks. Whatever it's warning us about, it might not be clear yet, but it's better to be safe. Let's keep the lights on tonight, and let's stay inside after dark from now on, for the next few days and weeks, that is. As I stood beside him listening, I noticed how he continued looking towards the landscape behind us. He looked deeply into the distance, almost like he was looking for something. It was clear that he was worried. Nothing happened to us that day, nor for the next few days. However, one of my aunts, who is my dad's sister, ended up in the hospital. I won't go into details about what happened, but she did pass away a few weeks after that. Knowing what I know now, those white owls are messengers. So if you see a white owl on the REZ, it doesn't mean that something is going to happen to you directly, but for sure it means that something is coming your way that is going to affect you. Stay safe. Check on your family. In many areas of the American West, cutting firewood in the national forest is a necessity if you want a warm house throughout the winter. Our home in central Idaho was no exception. It was normal for my dad to pick me and my brothers up after school and head into the mountains for an afternoon of firewood gathering. My dad would fell the dead trees and then saw them into chunks. My brothers and I had the task of rolling the wood to the truck and loading it. We would continue this assembly line process until we had a truckload of wood. It always happened before nightfall. Hot, sweaty, and exhausted, we would pile into the truck cab and make our way down the mountain. At home the next day, we would unload and split the wood and stack it into neat little bundles. This process was repeated until we had a winter's worth of fuel for the house, our grandma's cabin, and some extra for some neighbors. On this afternoon, we decided to try a different logging road on the other side of the valley. This was well outside our familiar logging area. There was no real reason for the change, but my dad said he wanted to change the scenery. This logging road wasn't maintained in some time. Large rocks and fallen branches littered the path. My brothers and I had to walk out in front, pushing rocks and going out of the way as my dad lurched the truck up the switchbacks. Yard by yard, we slowly made our way up the mountain. As we ascended the mountain and got further into the trees, this strange feeling started to set in. I wasn't sure if I was exhausted from the hike or something more. There was electricity in the air, like the whole mountain was buzzing at a wavelength just below my senses. In some odd way, it felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it wasn't welcoming our presence. I wanted to say something to my brothers, but before I opened my mouth, my younger brother said, "Does anybody else feel like we're not welcome here?" My older brother and I stopped in our tracks and looked back at him. Both of us nodded. This moment was broken by my dad honking and telling us to continue clearing the path. We continued pushing to a small clearing in the woods when we finally stopped the truck. My dad, oblivious to how we're feeling, or simply choosing to ignore it, he grabbed his saw and started working. As the wood was felled and loaded, I couldn't shake that feeling. I noticed my brothers were just taking glances over their shoulders as we worked. Everyone but my dad seemed to be on edge. The sun nestled down into the trees, and twilight began to set in as the light drained from the sky. My anxiety only intensified. It wasn't until my dad told us to load everything up that a wave of relief fluttered over me. I could sense the tension between my brothers start to fade away as well. The truck wasn't even fully loaded. It did throw me off, as we always left with the truck fully loaded. Getting a half load was basically a waste. According to my dad, we would sometimes work in the dark just to make sure the truck was full. But tonight he seemed persistent to head home. With everything loaded, we started down the road. Even though dead tired, Everyone seemed to be in a much lighter mood. We were patting and cracking jokes while trying to blow off steam from the afternoon. We were almost out of the tree line and into the valley desert. Whenever you go down the switchbacks, you want to be careful, especially when your truck is loaded, even if it was half, that is. That's when a brown blur jumped up from the downslope side of the switchback. The F-bomb was the only thing that came out of my dad's mouth as he slammed on the brakes. Loaded with wood and traveling downhill, there was no way to avoid smashing into whatever this thing was. The truck finally grounded to a standstill. The four of us peered through the windshield. Nobody said a word. Illuminated in the yellow glow of our headlights was the crumpled body of a deer. Grumbling and cursing the deer's existence, my dad got out the truck to investigate. Doing as we were told, my brother stayed put in the truck. I didn't listen, following close behind my dad. The truck was fine. We hadn't been traveling fast when we smacked the deer. Just some hair and blood on the grill guard. Hitting a deer wasn't really that unusual. The mountains were full of them. What was strange was that the deer dropped so quickly. At faster speeds, deer can still be upright and sprint away to die in the woods after a collision. You know, that last burst of adrenaline. But this one just fell over like a rag doll. A deep foul smell hit us before even approaching the carcass. Deer do smell bad when they're alive, but this was on a whole other level. It was the smell of decay and rot. My stomach began twisting as we got closer. My nostrils were burning, coming up on the deer. It was dead. Like, really dead. The stench was so overwhelming my eyes were watering. The body was a true horror scene. The deer's eyes were gone, replaced with holes as if to overcompensate for their absence. The tongue was swollen and black as coal. It couldn't be contained and it was hanging out the side of its mouth. The underbelly was split open. In the dim headlights, it looked as though the deer's fur was moving, wiggling almost. Holding my breath and covering my mouth, I bent down for a closer look. The deer inside and out was covered in maggots. It was dead alright, but our truck didn't kill it. Clearly it was dead for days, if not for a week or two. That's when that feeling came screaming back again. My dad was always the quiet, stoic type, but right now, even in the dim headlights of the truck, I could see the fear in his face. His gaze wasn't on the deer, but focused down the mountain. Poorly masking the fear in his voice, he told me firmly to walk back to the truck and get inside. I obeyed without objection. As I grabbed the door handle, a loud shriek came from the trees. Branches were shattering and breaking. Something was heading up the slope to us. I slammed my door closed just as my dad reached the truck. Before his door was shut, he had already started to press on the gas. The truck took off, sending us over the deer carcass and racing down the hill with me and my brothers panicking and yelling. At this point it was hard to tell if the shrieking was following us. Our truck popped out of the tree line and into the desert sagebrush. Once we made it out the woods, everything got quiet. We were left with only the rumble of the engine and the wind through the half-open windows. Pulling into our property, the truck came to a stop. We sat in silence. No one was moving to get out. That's when everyone started talking at once. All of us were asking, what was the screaming sound? How does a dead deer jump uphill in front of a truck? There was no way the truck killed it. Dad just shook his head in motion for us to quiet down. And that's when he said, that deer was dead when we hit it. It didn't jump out in front of us. It was thrown at us. We stared at him. That's when he explained that all day up on the mountain, he had a strange feeling, but not wanting to worry us. He kept it to himself. He described the feeling as walking into a stranger's living room while they were sleeping upstairs, and that feeling never left him. As twilight came, he happened to catch a shadow in the corner of his eye. He said he couldn't focus on them long enough for a good look before they dodged behind trees. He said that when he saw this, his stomach dropped. Working hard to keep his composure, he finally told us to get inside the truck so that we could leave. It was after hitting the deer and discovering it was long dead that my dad pieced everything together. Something threw that deer to get us to stop before the shrieking started. He could hear something moving in the darkness beyond the road. It was a trap. Running back to the truck could have started an ambush or triggered something. So we walked back to the truck. The moment that we were inside, he drove the truck downhill with no intention of stopping for anyone. That strange feeling didn't disappear until we hit the county highway. My brothers and I never saw anything as we drove away, but those screams from the forest will never leave my mind. We didn't even gather firewood for the rest of the season. For the first time in his life, my dad ended up buying just what we needed. Even though we started to gather wood again the next season, we never went back up that mountain. The Forest Service has permanently closed and reclaimed that road. The only way back up into those woods is by hiking, one that I'm not interested in. Whatever was on that mountain, whatever threw that deer carcass, whatever chased us out, it didn't want us there. It wanted us gone, or possibly worse, it wanted us dead. Today is 2 days away from the anniversary of my niece's death. No one knows how she died except her mother, who passed away recently, and me. I don't know who to tell, but I need to tell someone. No one would believe me anyway. They'll lock me up like they locked up my sister. I wouldn't blame them though. I hardly believe what happened myself. Bethany was going to be 10 years old the day after Christmas, the year she died. She still believed in Santa. I thought she was too old for that shit, but her parents thought it was cute. They did everything they could to keep her from realizing it was just a lie. Bethany loved Christmas and Santa and elves and all that. She used to tell me about an elf that would hide in her house. I just figured her parents must have been hiding a toy elf or something. But when I asked them about it and they said they didn't have any elf dolls, I thought they were joking. Bethany's stories about the elf started getting stranger. She told me that one night she woke up to the elf sitting on the dollhouse next to her bed, watching her with its empty glass eyes. After that night, she said the elf turned bad. She said it would move around her room, making strange noises at night, and she told me if she tried to get out of bed, the elf would run towards her and bite and claw her feet and ankles. The elf, she said, had too many teeth, which were long and thin but not pointed. She said its nails were long and sharp, like claws. I didn't believe her, but then she showed me the scars and new bite marks. The bite marks were normal human size, but very deep and definitely with more teeth marks. That's when I started to worry. I didn't believe in the elf at that point. I thought maybe she was doing it herself, and I thought she might have been seriously, mentally ill. I wish I was right. I told my sister my concerns about her daughter. She was worried too, so she found a psychiatrist for her. I thought that would help Bethany, but as Christmas came near, she seemed to get worse. I was staying over at my sister's house for Christmas Eve, and Bethany asked me to sleep in her room to protect her from the elf. I told her yes. I thought that was a good idea, so I could figure out what was going on with her. Maybe she was biting her own ankles in her sleep. That night, Bethany woke me up and asked if I would get her some water. She didn't want to get up because she was afraid the elf would attack her. I also didn't want to leave the poor girl in there alone, so I told her she had to come with me. She didn't want to come, but I wouldn't let her stay. I Should have listened. My God, maybe she would still be alive if I listened. It's my fault. She's dead. When we got by the door, I saw it. The elf was tall, with strange teeth and blank, white eyes. I thought I was imagining, so I turned on the light. But it didn't go away. I know I should have tried to leave, but instead, I tried to take a picture of it. As soon as I did, it started to run at us so fast, I could barely see it. Everything happened so fast. Bethany, who had been standing so still, pushed me out of the room so hard that I fell to the floor. The door slammed shut. All I could hear was a voice screeching so loud I could hardly hear Bethany's screams. It sounded like the voice was saying Merry Christmas, but it wasn't pronounced right. It sounded like Merry Christmas. I was trying to get back in the room, but the door was locked. I tried to kick it down, but I wasn't strong enough. I ran into the kitchen to find something to break the door as I called the police. They thought it was a joke. I don't understand how they didn't hear the screaming. How did her parents not wake up? I found a brick and decided that was good enough to make a hole in the door or something. Then I heard a ripping sound, and the screams and screeches stopped. I cautiously opened the door, which somehow unlocked, and the walls and the bed and all her toys and furniture were bright red, soaked in Bethany's blood. On the floor, the elf was hovering over Bethany's corpse. It was split in half vertically, and the elf was wearing her intestines around its neck and eating them. I screamed louder than I ever screamed before. Bethany's mother finally came out of her room and saw what happened. She didn't even make a sound. She just stared at the horrifying scene. We closed the door and put things in front so it wouldn't open. We went into the living room to wait for the police. When the police finally arrived, they questioned us and her husband, who hadn't heard a thing. I couldn't say anything. It was like a dream, so unreal. I just sat there, staring into space. The only one who told the police what happened was my sister. The police removed the barricade from the front of Bethany's room, but when they opened the door, nothing was there. The blood was gone. The elf, Bethany, everything. The room looked completely normal, besides snow blowing in from the window. Everything was gone like magic. The police stated a search party. They thought she ran away. After everyone left, I stood in her room alone and cried. I heard the sound of bells, and then I heard the elf whispering, Merry Christmas. I ran out of there. It's been over a year now since Bethany's death. After Bethany died, my sister's mental health began to go down. She boarded up the doors and windows of Bethany's old room. She never slept anymore. We found her trying to cut open her stomach several times, and we had to have her live in a mental hospital, where she ended up killing herself by making a noose out of her bed sheets. Now, I'm the only one who knows what happened. Everyone else still thinks she's missing. I don't go near that house anymore, and I can't bring myself to talk to Bethany's father. But no matter what I do to forget what happened, I can't. Sometimes I can still hear it, the voice of that elf at night, and I'm afraid it's going to kill me next. It's almost Christmas. This encounter takes place in Chinle, Arizona, at our house. The five of us, a school friend, two cousins, my sister and I, were all in high school at the time. We were hanging out and everyone decided to spend the night because it was the middle of the summer and it was so hot. We set up our folks' van and my older brother's pickup truck so we could sleep outside where there was at least a bit of a breeze. We spent most of the earlier part of the night doing what teenagers do, including a little smoke, if you know what I mean, and also a couple of beers. Sometime after midnight, the three girls decided to call it a night and climbed into the bed of the pickup truck. My friend and I stayed out on the porch for another hour or so before heading to the van. We must have dozed off soon afterwards. According to my sister, she's a year younger than me. She is still awake, just lying there and looking up at the stars. The sky out here is really clear at night. There are stars everywhere. When out of nowhere, the neighbor's dogs from across the dry bed start to bark, which around here means that the local wildlife is out and about. My sister says she is listening between the sounds of the dogs to see if she can hear what's out there. Black against black, she suddenly sees this figure crouched on the roof of the pickup and staring down at her. She becomes absolutely frozen, partially out of fear and partially through no will of her own. She wants to scream or at least say something, but she can't find her voice. It's as if she's gasping for air, but without making any noise, and as if her lungs just won't fill. Just then, our younger cousin wakes up. She says because out of nowhere she gets this feeling of intense dread. She sits up kind of suddenly, and at the same time, it is like my sister is released from a spell. The air rushes into her lungs, and she lets out a scream, pointing to the top of the truck, but whatever it was is now gone. All three girls are now wide awake and panicking. They jump out of the back of the pickup and make for the house where my parents are sound asleep. My friend and I, totally oblivious to the excitement and somewhat under the influence, remain blissfully unconscious. Inside the house, my sister tells the other girls what she saw, or at least thinks she saw. At first they're all scared, but then they just start laughing. Then they become brave. My sister grabs a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and the three of them venture out into the dark yard. They come off the porch and paint the front of the property with the beam of the flashlight. They see nothing of interest. Now they head towards the back of the house, all together as if the light is some kind of shield. As the beam moves across the open yard, and then to the hill of the back of the property, they see this figure moving quickly and steady, but in an awkward way, as if it has a new pair of shoes, making its way to the top. Before they can get a good look, it disappears over and down to the other side. My sister wants to go after it, but my two cousins pull her back towards the house. They go inside and wake up my parents. My mother refuses to leave the house, but my father, thinking that he's got some sort of thief running around his property, grabs his shotgun, 20 gauge, and makes for the hill. Of course, whoever or whatever it is no longer to be seen. He fires off 2 shots into the darkness anyway. Not that she needs to after those 2 shotgun blasts, but my sister then comes over to the van to wake us up to go inside the house. The only thing I'm asking is why the old man is blasting away into the night. She tells me her story. My friend, who definitely partied harder than I did, doesn't stir an inch. I told my sister I'm staying where I am, so the 3 girls decide they too are staying outside and set up watch. All 3 girls promise they won't fall asleep. Nevertheless, the 2 cousins are soon nodded out, and my sister is again alone with the stars. She says it's no more than 20 minutes, if even that many, when she hears what sounds like someone talking to themselves in Navajo. But it's old Navajo, and she doesn't know what's being said. The sound is coming from back by the hill. My sister wakes up the other two girls, and they run back up to the house. My sister makes her way back to my parents' room. My dad is out like a light and not responding. My mother, however, is talking in her sleep, as if she's admonishing someone. At the same time, she is invoking the name of Jesus. We are Christian after all. The next morning, my sister is asking her if she remembers any of it. My mother recalls having a dream in which something dark and menacing is outside the door trying to find its way in. She has no doubt it was evil, but she says that the prayer she did made it go away. Anyways, at the same time my mother is talking in her sleep, my sister feels a presence to the back door of the house of something she describes as evil. All three girls swear there's a heavy smell of something dead, which makes them nauseous. No sooner does my mother name Jesus, the feeling and the smell go away. When morning comes and the sun is up high and bright, the three girls and my mother go outside and have a look around. There, up on the hill, is a spot in the high grass that's all flat, as if something was sitting there. But there are no trails, tracks, or footprints of any kind. As they all come back to the house, my sister leaves the group and goes to the pickup where she left her sandals. She finds upon one of them a clump of long black hair, frizzy and tangled. All of the girls, including my mother, have dark hair, but none of them like that clump. She shows it to my mother, who tells her to immediately throw it into the fire of the stove. She tells her it is the mark of a skinwalker, who intends to do bad medicine and must be destroyed. This happened back in 2016 or so. My ex at the time and I were road tripping around Utah. We started in Seagull Canyon by Thompson Springs north of Crescent Junction. It's a very cool, creepy spot with Native American rock art dating back to right around 2000 BC, almost 4,000 years ago. I would highly recommend it, but be warned, it's eerie, and I tend to believe Native Americans painted those petroglyphs as warnings of some sort. From there we hopped back onto I-70 and through Green River and then south on 24, which actually takes you right past Goblin State Park. It was about 2 in the morning by the time we got to Goblin, and my girlfriend was asleep with my dog Cookie in the back of my truck. So I decided to pull over to take a little break and stretch my legs. So I pulled over to the side of the road and got out to have a toke. And that's when I noticed something was off. It was too quiet. The night was too still. Just then, a deer ran out of the brush and nearly gave me a heart attack. Laughing a bit, I took a few steps out into the darkness so as to not wake up my ex. I unzipped to go, and that's when I heard my dog growling from the back of the truck. "Cookie, Cookie," I whispered. "Hush, it's just me." "Come look over here, baby." "What the?" My girlfriend's voice from out in the shadows. But when had she gotten out of the truck? And why hadn't I noticed her walk past me? "Lauren," I said, walking towards the voice. "Come look over here, baby," she said again. "Lauren, are you okay? What's going on?" I asked. Cookie's low growl then turned into a ferocious bark, which actually snapped me out of my trance. And that's when I heard Lauren, the real Lauren, from back at the truck. "Connor?" she said in a half-sleep state. If that's Lauren, then who? I was knocked flat on my back, and I looked up to see what looked like a half-lady, half-coyote creature peering down at me. Her eyes were somehow beautiful, with a soft white glow to them that reminded me of winter. Her nose was long and looked like a coyote, but without the fur, and she had long white teeth protruding out from her mouth. She had 2 tall pointy ears on the top of her head, and she appeared to be wearing a coyote pelt around her shoulders. She tilted her head to the side before opening her mouth, revealing a row of dagger-like teeth. Her lower jaw was hanging down in an unnatural angle, and she looked like she was making it bigger to bite my head off or something. That's when Cookie came bolting out of the back of the truck, slamming into the creature with some considerable force, knocking her off me. That's when I saw the rest of her body. She was long, at least 6 feet, and she had a full bushy tail, but her hands and feet were those of a human woman. Her body was wrapped in furs, but you could see black and red stripes painted on her naked body in between the patchy pelts. She then started to kick Cookie off of her and ran off into the bush. I ran over to make sure Cookie was okay, and thank God she was. I scooped her up and ran back to the truck. "We gotta go," I said, stumbling up to the driver's seat. We peeled out onto the road, and I started driving way too fast. 40, 50, 60, which is when I hit a cow. That's right, I hit a cow. Apparently there was a whole herd of cattle crossing the road. Lucky for us, I just barely clipped her head right as she started to cross the road. The poor cow then started to heave, but I knew I couldn't just leave her there in agony. I then got out of the car to cut her throat with this big knife I got from a gas station. And that's when I saw her. The Skinwalker was back. She had followed us, and it was most likely her that had spooked the cattle out into the road in the first place. The rest of the herd took off, and then it was just me, her, and the dying cow on the road. Cookie was going nuts in the back of the truck, and I could hear Lauren gasp as this coyote lady, creature, took a step towards us with her lower jaw still hanging down from her face, and her eyes reflecting the light from the headlights. Just then, another car came up over the rise, and the coyote lady looked up, and I swear it felt like she was staring straight into my soul, before letting out a blood-curdling scream and leaping off the road back into the night. The other car pulled up, and as luck would have it, it was a BLM ranger who had seen us hit the cow. She pulled out her service Glock and put the poor cow out of her misery. I then told her what happened, but she told us it was most likely a coy wolf, a coyote-wolf hybrid that's new to the region. Lauren was in a state of shock, and I didn't want us to get taken off to the loony bin, so I took the ticket for hitting a cow out on open range, and we drove to Hanksville, where we got a room for the night. I couldn't sleep a wink. Every time I closed my eyes, I just kept seeing her. And those eyes, those glowing, hypnotic, and yet somehow wild, elegant eyes. I often wonder since then who this woman was. What was she doing out there? Does she fully shift from coyote to woman? Or is she always like that? I have so many unanswered questions. I kind of want to go out and try to find her again. I just can't stop thinking about her. Sometimes I have dreams about her. What do you think? Should I try to go and find her? Let me know. Upon a recent discussion with an alumnus from a previous supply caravan to Black Mesa on the Navajo REZ, It has come to my attention that one of the gals who accompanied the caravan a couple years ago had a very curious experience. I was able to get her contact info. Let's call her Amanda, and we'll interview her about her encounter. In an effort to be respectful of the culture and the taboo nature of the subject matter, we decided to change the names and category of whatever this is that she experienced down there. Just a bit of background. There is a company called Peabody Coal Mining, which leases tracts of land in and around Black Mesa, and the landscape is one of shadow topographical relief marked by dry draws and arroyos, which are essentially dry creek beds that flood during periods of heavy rain, which, granted, is not a very common occurrence in the high deserts of Arizona. This is what Amanda said. I was trying to retrieve a lamb who had escaped from the enclosure one afternoon. When I turned around, I couldn't seem to retrace my steps back to, quote-unquote, Johnny's compound, where his parents' hogan is located. I was following one of the arroyos, hoping it would lead me to a road. That's when I started having asthma. I think that I started hyperventilating and had a full-blown panic attack because I lost consciousness, and when I came to it, it was nighttime. I stood up and looked around. I heard something like a twig snapping behind me and turned around to look. In the pale moonlight, I thought I saw something ducked behind a tree. It looked like the dark shape of a person who had been peering around the tree, but then withdrew when I noticed it. But I could tell that it was still there. So I called out, "Hello?" Silence. "Hello? Is someone there? I'm with the Colorado caravan. I think I'm lost." I laughed nervously. "Can you help me?" After a moment or so, this figure peered back around the tree. Only this time, it looked like my friend Charlie from the caravan. The figure then stepped out from behind the tree and motioned me to follow, thinking that Charlie had been sent to bring me back to camp, and still feeling a bit confused. I started to follow the figure back up the draw. We've been walking for maybe 5 to 10 minutes when another figure seemingly materialized from the shadows out in front of us. I felt a bolt of pain, like a severe migraine, and had to stop. When I looked up, there were 3 more figures, and they were standing in a semicircle before me. Now these things did not look human at all, but rather like large coyotes, and I could see 10 eyes looking back at me in the dim silvery light. I started to stumble back, but the coyotes made no move to follow as I turned to run away. I ran for maybe 5 minutes before I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I heard another twig snap and looked back to see one of the coyote-shaped silhouette up on the ridgeline from back towards the direction from which I had ran. To my horror, the coyote appeared to stand up on its hind legs and let out a bone-chilling scream. I heard other people describe this before, but it almost sounded like a coyote howl, magnified through a megaphone and then distorted with a heavy reverb-like sound effect. My head was pounding, but I truly felt in fear for my life, so I kept running. Eventually, I came to a service road and was able to flag down a Peabody mine worker who was driving down the road in a work vehicle. I convinced him to give me a ride and told him our caravan leader, Buck, could explain the situation to his manager if need be. As I climbed into the cab and we started driving, I looked in the rear view mirror and saw those eyes reflecting the red brake lights from the back of the truck. I don't think they followed us, but I couldn't be sure. So when the mine worker dropped me off at the compound, I ran into Johnny's parents' hogan, which is a big no-no for non-natives, but I didn't know where else to go, and I was still very scared. Johnny's parents only spoke Diné, but I was finally able to express the gist of what happened in between broken sobs and sniffling. I saw Johnny's father's face go pale as he realized what I was trying to say. He quickly shushed me and went to look out the window. Johnny's mom went to the stove and collected a small pan of ashes. She then dumped out on the table and started dipping bullets into them, loading them into a .357. She was singing what I can only assume was a Dania prayer for protection and looking worried at me. They let me sleep inside and nothing more happened that night. In the morning they called the medicine man to come and pray over me. We still had a couple nights left but decided to call the trip short after that. Johnny said not to worry, that the walkers wouldn't bother them anymore now that we were leaving, and that he was just glad that I was okay. Suffice to say, I won't be going on any more caravans anytime soon. I know everyone says not to go searching for these things, these skinwalkers. Well, I can't tell you how much I regret not heeding that advice. Now, I spent a considerable amount of time on the Navajo REZ in the past, so I thought I knew what I was doing. It's actually not that hard to find a skinwalker if you know what you're looking for, and if you do certain things, they'll come to you, as long as you're in one of the active areas. Such areas are in the path of the skinwalker, as it were, where a local clan of skinwalkers will come together to hold council and carry out their various rites and rituals and plan their evil doings. Kayenta, Arizona, is a town on the Navajo Nation at the intersection of Highway 160 and Highway 163. There's a pizza place there called Pizza Edge. Nearby is a car wash and a gas station, as well as a couple other little fast food restaurants. The whole area is just dirt, except for the mentioned highways, which are paved. Anyways, I mention this because that's about all there is to Kayenta. That plus a high school and a couple small hotels, a church, a post office, and a grocery store. The houses consist mainly of Navajo-style hogans and double-wide trailers. It all started in that small downtown area next to the Pizza Edge. As soon as I pulled into the small dirt parking lot, I noticed a Navajo man and a dog sitting in the shade. The man appeared to be asleep, but the dog was looking right at me, only its eyes were strange, vaguely human somehow. It was starting to get dark, so I went in to grab a slice of cheese pizza. When I returned, the dog was next to my car, standing on two legs and trying to get in my open windows. I shouted at the dog and it dropped back to all fours and scampered off. I didn't see the man anywhere, so I got in my car and drove out of town a couple of miles to find a place to park for the night. I had a garbage bag with which I collected some roadkill along the way. I had found a dead coyote, a couple skunks, a raccoon, and a fox. I placed the dead animals out in a field where two natural draws met to form an open space next to a small pond. I had a hot cup of coffee and I was ready to stay up all night if need be. At some point, however, I did fall asleep and woke with a start when I realized it was the middle of the night and someone or something was walking around my car. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out the window. Boy, do I wish I hadn't done that. There was that dog again, except it was walking on two legs, peering in at me. I froze up. I couldn't move a muscle. The dog was breathing on the window, causing it to fog up in the light. Its eyes just looked wrong, like a human's eyes in the face of a dog. I jumped into the driver's seat and tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. That thing was trying to open the door, and I could hear it scratching its claws along the side of my car. Finally, the engine turned over, and I was able to start the car. I hit the gas and sped out of there like a bat out of hell. I could see that dog thing in my rear view mirror, still running on 2 legs, before dropping back down onto all 4 legs and veering off into the night. I don't know what I was thinking, but that experience really scared me. Don't go looking for these things. They're out there, and they might just have you for dinner. The nighttime brought 2 rules we had to live by, no matter what family you come from. You are to not look outside or be outside. This one night brought my brother to sneak out to meet a girl who lived nearby. Teenage stuff, if you get what I'm saying. Anyways, the later hours of the night, and he's sneaking back through his window. As he's getting ready to pull himself in from the absolute darkness of the night, he heard my dog growling a few feet behind him. The dog we had at the time was from a known, highly aggressive breed, but to hear him growling came as a surprise to my brother. He claimed to call out soft to the dog, but the dog was unresponsive. After a few seconds, my brother slowly began walking towards the dog, and as he got closer, the smallest glint of light hit my dog's face. As his face softly lit, my brother realized that the dog was not looking at him, but the area of the roof right above his bedroom window. As he slowly turned and looked at the empty space, he began to recognize that heart-sinking feeling of somebody or something watching him, along with the sounds like if something was sitting perched on the edge of the roof. The more time went by, the more dread he felt. He was so scared that he rushed through his window and to our mother, panicking and telling her what he did and what was going on. She was so scared she wasn't even bothered by the fact he snuck out. I remember watching and listening from my bedroom door and seeing her turn pale and begin to shake. She told him to never do it again and to keep his window closed. It was from that day on that not only our neighbors, but people from the complete opposite side of the community began to open up about their experiences with the thing that walks among us at night on the roofs of the house. One of which includes a close relative who was home alone with an aunt. One night, she claimed to begin hearing something clawing and walking on the roof. When she noticed it, she said it was like it noticed her or knew she was there, because when she tried to find a room to shield herself in, the footsteps followed right above. Think of your ceiling made out of glass, and this thing always knowing exactly where your foot is falling, and the exact moment you extend your foot, there is another step. It wasn't until I reached my 20s that I began experiencing this creature on a weekly, yes, I said weekly, and I am not exaggerating. It was like clockwork, especially once snow began falling. Heavy footsteps before the sun was up that woke me up around 5 a.m. at least once a week. Here and there those footsteps would be substituted for what I only imagine is a grown man in steel-toed boots running with what sounded like chains dragging. I was so desperate for sleep and to not be bothered that I started putting holy water on my ceiling, but it seemed to only hold off whatever this being was for a few days before coming back again. As time went by, not only did my neighbor, but the residents who lived several houses away would tell my family about their experiences with the thing that lurked on top of our houses. One neighbor was simply sitting in the living room when he began to hear like somebody was walking above him. He said it left him paralyzed with fear, and all he could do was sit and stare in horror at the area above him. Another friend who lived 3 houses down was taking out her garbage when she heard walking right above her doorway, and left her so scared she ran inside and refused to be out at night for months. I can go on and on about the stories that left our friends, family, and neighbors shaken to the core for hours, but for now, this seems to be the most nightmarish creatures our people have continuously shared the space with since we were forced into colonization. Even though these stories and these experiences can spark a lot of interest in seeking out these beings, I simply ask that no one actually take the time to. You never know what might follow you and make your home its home as well. Maybe those noises you hear in your attic at night when you're going to sleep are actually coming from your roof, and maybe it's something that has followed you already because of these stories and these experiences that you dig into. If you think you have one of these things making your home their home, I would recommend to call a priest or a medicine man, somebody who's familiar with these things, because if not, next time it might be outside your window. I grew up in the woods. I was raised by a single foster parent, Margie, and she was too busy to bother with me. So instead of hanging with my foster siblings, I went into the woods. By the time I could drive, I was spending more time in the woods than I was at home. In all seriousness, I don't think I slept at home one night my senior year. There was something about being in the forest that made me feel at peace, something that kept Margie's shit parenting at bay. Over those years, I learned nearly everything about the forest that a kid my age could. Foxes sound like people, cougars are perfect hunters, bears can climb trees, and the most important thing, if the forest goes silent, something is wrong. If you're gonna take anything away from the story, I pray that you make it that. Silence is not good when you're deep in the forest. Like anyone in my situation would, I moved away from home as soon as I could. I packed up my room, loaded up my truck, and found a nice outdoors town by a state over. I was beyond excited when I saw an ad in the newspaper about some trapping gear that someone wanted to sell. Trapping and hunting were some of the better jobs I could work as they paid well, and being born native meant that I could apply for a year-round hunting permit. Plus, it would give me an excuse to live up in the woods and only leave every once in a while. With that idea in mind, I called the owner of the gear, his name was Clark, and asked what he was selling and what it might cost. He told me that the set contained 8 different traps, an animal call box, snares, knives, and a Winchester 1200. He was selling everything for $2,500. I had saved up money that I had made or that was gifted to me, and being young and dumb, I bought everything. Within a week of buying the gear, I bought my permit, and the state I'm in requires a separate trapping license, so I got that one too. All that set me back another $400, but I was finally ready to live like I wanted to. Clark said that there was a hunting lodge I could stay at. No one owned it, so it was free to stay. People would repair it when it needed to be fixed, and that was about it. From that point on, I became a woodsman, and I lived like that for a few years, spending more time in the woods than in my own apartment. Trapping had actually made me a good amount of money, and when furs and pelts weren't doing too well, the meat and the claws sold well too. I had become accustomed to the noises from the woods, animal calls, god-awful noises, wind blowing through the top layers of the trees. All those sounds became ingrained in me. So now, I guess I'll tell you all why I'm actually writing this. Last weekend, I went up to the lodge to settle in. There was no one at the lodge when I got there, which is pretty normal for midsummer. I'm the only native that hunts up here, so I'm the only one that stays here all year. Aside from a single backpack on one of the beds, the lodge was barren. I set my gear down, grabbed a can of soup, and headed to the kitchen to make myself something to eat. As I walked past one of the windows, I saw something along the edge of the trees. The lodge was in the middle of a circular break in the forest, so the area around the lodge was just open. No canopy, no trees, just grass and ferns. On the edge of the tree line was something. It was a little too dark under the shade of the trees to really make out what it was, but something was definitely there. I tried to study the figure, looking for a shape or some color, but it was too hidden, and I came up empty. Eventually, the figure faded out of sight, walking into the deeper part of the woods. As the sun started to go down, the watercolor sky changed from a light blue to a deep purple, before fading out into blackness. I took out some of the snares, grabbed my shotgun, and walked out of the lodge. I like to set the snares at night, that way the animals trip them when they wake up to look for food. It just makes more sense. Clicking on the barrel-mounted flashlight, I stepped outside. Something instantly felt wrong, almost like if I was somewhere new. I had walked the woods at night hundreds of times, but they felt unfamiliar now. The wind blew far above the treetops, adding an almost musical sound to the surrounding area. After I got a few snares set up, I decided that I would finish the others once the sun came up, and I started walking back to the trail leading to the lodge. On the way, just before I broke the tree line next to the trail, I saw someone walking on the path, just out of the reach of my flashlight. He didn't seem to have any gear, and he must have been walking by the light of the moon, as I didn't see the beam from a flashlight. Feeling like a bit of a trickster, I clicked my light on, and made my way silently back onto the trail. My plan was to sneak up on the guy and scare him. Seeing as he didn't have a gun, I figured I wouldn't get my head blown off. He was pretty far ahead of me, so I tried to walk a little bit faster, but he made it over one of the hills on the trail and left my line of sight. Expecting him to pop back up on the other side any second, I hustled a little bit to close the gap. When I got closer to the hill, a shriek ripped through the nearby woods. I heard every animal in those woods make every noise they could, and I still have no idea what could have let that scream out. It sounded like the call of some ancient, terrible beast, a creature that was far more intelligent than anything else in the woods. I switched my light back on and called out for the man I saw earlier, but he was nowhere to be found. Part of me was hoping he took off running towards the lodge, but every ounce of me knew that I couldn't wait around to check. So I bolted back up the trail, and that's when the horrible noise came tearing through the woods again. That's when it hit me. Apart from the noises and my footfalls, the forest was silent. No birds, no small animals, even though the wind had gone away. There was absolutely no noise. My boots stamped against the dirt, kicking up dust and rocks as I tore up the path trying to run. I've been hunted by cougars, bears, wolves, but this time, something felt different. I still felt like something was watching me, burning its eyes in me as I ran. Only instead of it watching out of a territorial need or a need for food, was actually playing with me, like it was allowing me to keep going, like it was waiting for me to catch some air. By the time the lodge came into view, another noise, another shriek. This time, it sounded much closer. I pushed the door open, and when I spun around to slam the door shut, I saw the same man from earlier. He seemed very calm, and he stopped just as he broke through the tree line. Nothing about him seemed normal. How did he end up behind me? I had been looking ahead the whole time, and I never passed him. Apparently, he was right on my heels too. At least if he was that close when I got to the cabin. But I didn't hear him behind me. When he started to walk, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Whatever he wasn't getting in here. Using my flashlight, I went around and turned all the lights in the lodge on, and then checked all the windows and entrances. Once the place was secured, I sat down on a bed and tried to sleep it off, thinking that the sun would force whatever I heard to retreat. Within seconds of snoozing, I was woken up by the sound of banging on a window. The grogginess of my sleep was wearing off as I neared the source of the banging. From afar, I could make out a vague, white shape in the window. The longer I stared, the more clear it became. It was the exact same guy from earlier, face pressed against the glass, with his hand banging on the window. Hoping that I could just walk up and ask what he wanted, I started to walk ahead, slowly. When I got within an arm's length of the window, the man stopped slamming his hand into the window, and instead, his jaw dropped. At first it stayed at a normal distance, but after a while, his jaw began to crack, and it descended even further down. His mouth was hanging open, and I noticed the sound, quiet at first, coming from his throat. It was a low, deep groan. After a few seconds of groaning, a voice came from him.
Open window.
That's all he said. Nothing more, nothing less. He was just repeating that line over and over.
Open window. Open window. Open window.
No emotion. I told him to fuck off, that I wasn't gonna die because he wanted to come in. When he didn't back off, I turned and grabbed my shotgun, walked back up, and placed the barrel against the window.
Open window. Open window.
He began to shake like he was having a violent seizure, twitching, maybe from the cold, maybe from something else. That's when the same piercing shriek from earlier came out of the dark hole that was his throat, and he slipped away in the darkness, leaving the window. I was able to get a little bit of sleep that night, but I was briefly awoken a few times by more noises and more shrieks. When the sun had started to creep up through the sky the next morning, I checked all the windows and then deemed it safe enough to go outside. Circling the lodge, I noticed a few things. Footprints leading from the same window that this man or thing was at, back to the forest. And on the other side of the same window were deep scratches. Other than that, the surrounding area was normal. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was feeling safe enough to be able to walk down to the trail and to my truck. So I grabbed my gear and noticed that the same backpack was still there. It had been there since I got to the lodge, and I figured that someone might have left it up there and forgot about it. I figured I would grab it and leave an ad in the paper about it. I loaded up the backpack and left the lodge, not even bothering to check on the snares. The trail seemed longer than it had ever been before, and the hiking down felt uneasy, but it wasn't until I got within sight of my truck that I really lost it. Just as I came to the part where the trail opens up, I decided to take one last look into the woods, and behind a fallen tree, I saw him. The same man from earlier, standing there, watching me. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped in the truck and drove off. As I sped down the road back to town, I noticed something in the woods alongside the car, just ahead of me. Looking outwards towards the road was the same man, but something about him looked different. His arms seemed to hang down to his knees, and his face looked more sunken. Fearing that he would find a way into the car, I floored the gas and hoped there wouldn't be any state troopers out. I got back to town and headed home. I needed to rest, and a few days later, I decided to head to City Hall and turn in the backpack and warn someone about what I had seen. Before I even got to the permit section of the building, I was stopped by the lady at the front desk. She asked me if I'd been out by the lodge, and I told her yes. She asked me to wait in the lobby, and I agreed. After a few minutes, the sheriff showed up and asked to talk with me. Apparently, a day or two before I went into the woods, there had been an animal attack. A hiking group of 3 people. One died, one was missing, and the one that made it back, really bad. The sheriff wanted to know if I saw any strange animal activities, and I told him what happened. Instead of disbelief and a laugh, he asked me to take a look at a picture and see if I recognized it. When he took the picture out of his pocket, I almost had a panic attack. It was the same man I had seen in the forest. It looked like a driver's license photo or something. The sheriff wasn't surprised when I told him that was the same man. He actually thanked me and left the building. I wanted to just forget about everything, like it never happened, to go on with my life and keep living how I'm used to. But there's one issue. Sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I swear I see the same man. But now, his arms are far longer than any human arm, and his jaw still hangs loose and open. I think it followed me from the trail, and I'm not sure what to do. When I was 8 years old, both of my parents worked full-time. My dad was on third shift at his job, and my mom was a school teacher. We lived right up the road from my grandparents in a very small town. It was getting close to my 9th birthday when I got strep throat and scarlet fever. I ended up severely sick. I could barely speak, had the first case of cold sweats that I remember in my life, and could barely pull myself out of bed to even use the restroom. My poor mother was at a loss of what to do with her working, and my dad needing to use daylight hours to sleep. The first day I was sick, my dad stayed up most of the day with me, made me food, wiped my forehead down, made sure I took my medicine, and everything else. But on the second day, my grandmother had called and offered to let me stay at her house so my dad could sleep. He said yes and woke me up around 7 that morning to drive me up to her place. My grandfather also worked at this time as well, so he was already gone to work when I got there. I don't remember too much of the early morning. I must have just slept in my grandmother's bed, tossing and turning, when I would wake up feeling extra bad. She encouraged me to swallow my awful tasting medicine, a little more gently than my dad did at least. She did fix me some tomato soup to try to eat, and it was the first time since I gotten sick that I had an appetite. I should mention that my grandmother had this little small dog named Samson. Samson came into the room and curled up next to me as I dozed off. I do know when I woke up at some point, it had to be the early afternoon lunchtime, because I could hear the TV from the living room on some game show. My grandmother had a ritual of eating her lunch while watching a game show. I think it was The Price is Right. I was trying to fall back asleep because I got this really bad headache coming, maybe from dehydration. I was on the edge of falling asleep when I suddenly woke up by "Samson!" scream that erupted from the living room. The dog curled up next to my feet, perked up, but didn't move. I knew I heard his name being called, but it was strange. He didn't respond. "Samson!" my grandma called again. "Samson!" The dog still didn't run out of the room to her. I was confused, as he was obedient to my grandmother. He was almost frozen, staring at the cracked open door, but making no attempt to go to her. She called again, "Samson!" maybe 3 or 4 more times. "Samson! Samson! Samson!" Then, I actually got annoyed. I remember flinging the covers off of me. Of course, all of my clothes is sticky with sweat, and I just feel uncomfortable and groggy. I stumble out of the room, wiping my eyes and asking, "Grandma, do you need Samson? He's in your room with me. I'm in the living room and I have to do a double take. The TV is still on and loud." There's a bowl of soup sitting on the coffee table, and also an open Pepsi next to it. But my grandmother isn't anywhere in the room. Maybe she's in the bathroom. I crossed the room and went past the kitchen, but it was empty too. I got to the bathroom door, which was shut. Nothing. I then opened it. No one was in there. The house is empty. It's not a huge house either. I went by through every single room. So yeah, my first reaction was to get scared. I could clearly hear my grandmother calling for the dog, but she's not anywhere inside. I can feel my hands and feet get all tingly. I start shouting for my grandma, but my voice is just echoing through the small cramped home. Samson had gotten up at this point and was sitting near the couch, looking completely undisturbed. I fumbled for the remote and turned the TV off, and yelled to the top of my lungs, which you can imagine how painful this was with a scratchy, infected throat. "Grandma!" The worst part happened next. That's when I heard my grandma shouting my name back, clear as ever, like she was standing only feet away. I start crying now, scared out of my mind. I feel like maybe it has to be a ghost. I grew up with scary ghost stories courtesy of my dad, and I'm convinced now that I'm in the room with a ghost. And then she, whatever this was, proceeded to call my name again. Then there was a second voice. Definitely not my grandmother's. It was deeper, definitely more masculine, and terrifying, as it said,
"Come to the front door."
Of course I didn't go. Instead, I made sure to run back to my grandparents' bedroom, lock the door, and pick up the telephone on their nightstand. I called my own home phone and my dad's sleepy voice answered. Through a barely comprehensible voice, I managed to croak something like, "Dad, there's someone in the house and I can't find Grandma. She's gone." My dad of course said he jumped out of bed, grabbed his army knife he kept in a drawer next to the bed, and ran down the road to the house in his PJs and bare feet. He ran up to the front door, jiggled the handle. It was locked. So he made his way around, and since he knew the garage code, just punched it in and got inside. A quick sweep of the 3 rooms of the home showed no one was in there. It's not like there was really anywhere to hide. I ran out of the room once I was sure he was there, and began crying in his arms. He kept reassuring me that there was no one here, and then he asked if I knew where Grandma was at. I said I didn't, and explained that I woke up to her calling for Samson, but she hadn't been anywhere there. This was back when cell phones were definitely around, but there were no iPhones, and my grandparents weren't going to be buying them anyways. My dad had a cell phone, but he didn't have it on him at the time. I could tell he was trying to keep calm, so he just said we would need to go back to our house. I was sure he was going to call the police at that point, just because my grandma still hadn't popped up, and her vehicle was still in the driveway when he got in. If she had left, she must have gone on foot. We hadn't even made 2 steps out of the driveway when from my grandma's neighbor's house, my grandma was strolling out, talking to the neighbor. She then saw my dad, and then she saw me, crying my eyes out, and immediately ran over to see what was wrong. She was super apologetic. She said she had stepped out right when she had heated up her soup to go see her neighbor, who had called about looking at something that my grandma was gonna buy. My grandma figured I was asleep, and she thought she would only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. At first, people may have assumed I was feverish, therefore confused, but I still stand by what happened. I know for a fact I was definitely alone in the house with Samson, but the voices I heard were real. For a while, I refused to go back to my grandma's house because this happened in the middle of the fucking day. I later read stories at school about Wendigos, or the creatures that would disguise their voices to draw people. This was the best explanation I could ever form about what I heard. I never shared to anyone that I thought it was for sure a Wendigo, and chalked it up to maybe just a ghost. I'm close to my 20s now. Last year was the first time I shared the story fully to my grandpa, who actually just used to say, "The fever you had must have made you had bad dreams." We were sitting on the front porch of the house, smoking cigarettes, and exchanging stories. When I finished telling him, for the first time he looked sort of disturbed about it. He finally put his cigarette out and just stared out into the road. Then he cleared his throat and looked over to me. "You know," he said slowly, "some funny things used to happen around that time, in the middle of the night. I would wake up to take a piss or something. When I would first sit up in the bed, I could hear your grandma sleeping away, snoring." He chuckled, but his face grew serious again. "Anyways, I would always hear her calling for the dog. I tried to remain looking calm, but my voice still shook when I asked, 'Even when she was sleeping? Sleep talking?' No." He shook his head. "I listened. I actually heard her calling from outside. Maybe the living room. She would call for the dog. She would call my name. All while she was really sleeping next to me. Sleeping like a baby." "Well, have you ever told anyone?" "No, I don't want to scare her. She's real scared of ideas like ghosts. That's why when you were younger and this thing happened, I told her just to remember you've been sick, fever and all. Most likely having nightmares." He looked gravely at me. "Don't repeat this to her, please. She's really not the type to be scaring." I wanted to cry. I had this itchy, creepy feeling suddenly about being at the house. "Hey Grandpa, do you still hear it sometimes?" "Of course, I still do." He was now reaching into his breast pocket to get out another cigarette. "I hear him every night, but you just gotta remember not to do what it says. Even the dog figured this out. If it says come to the door, you stay away from the door. If it says come here, you just stay still in the room until it quits calling." And with that, he asked to borrow my lighter again. I have a story. It's not mine, but it happened to my uncle. He used to tell this story when we went camping, and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my uncle Mark went on a mission at 19. They sent him to a native reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there was a huge argument with the locals on the reservation about them going there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the res. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big and was located next to a wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep when all of a sudden their trailer started to shake violently, back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under the table for cover. Mark could hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, like a group of people. And then, after about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the res and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking the night before. The family got very quiet and then told him they had to leave. They thought it was pretty strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night it happened again. They were awakened by the trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them they had to leave. Mark started thinking that because of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the res. They then went into a store and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they asked, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the Skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought the cleric was just trying to scare them. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, flew it open, and yelled. When he did that, he saw 3 animals run off. 2 were a wolf, 1 was a bear. However, they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all 3 of them stood up on 2 legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human, cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president that next morning and asked to be moved. They were relocated that day, and for a year, nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city, and Mark was getting a new companion named Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they traveled went through the boundaries of the REZ. They arrived at 8 p.m. and picked them up. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We're driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy then says that he's fine. The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insisting he was fine, so they hit the road. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries. Jimmy starts complaining that he needed a pee so bad. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You're gonna have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I seriously can't hold it anymore." So the mission president stops the car and says, "But you will do your business next to the door, and if I say get in the car, you need to get in the car fast." Jimmy was looking confused and said, "Alright." And then he opens the door and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just pulls Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. "What's going on?" The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car to his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the vehicle. Mark then looked over at the gauges. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still going faster. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. They didn't speak after this whole situation. And then he says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you need to take care of your business." Our annual camping trip was always a perfect time to get away from the daily busyness of life. A way to reconnect with nature and each other. It's something we had been doing since we had gotten out of high school. Every summer, my friends and I would choose a different, often remote location to explore and go camping. And so this summer, the 6 of us, Sarah, Mike, Jennifer, Luke, Emily, and I, decided to go further up north in Utah, into the Wasatch Cache National Forest. When the day finally arrived, we met at dawn. We had decided to take my beat-up old van that my father had given me as a graduation gift after high school, around 6 years or so. It was a family possession that was being passed down, so you can imagine what it looked like. I do gotta say, even though I was embarrassed about it at first, it is still running and getting me from point A to point B without any issues. It was spacious and had enough seats for all of us to ride together, even with all of our gear, which included all of our tents and camping stuff. The drive to the national forest was beautiful, and it also had amazing views. The road stretched before us as hours passed. and the landscape shifted from small roads to being surrounded by dense trees. We share stories, and the occasional debate about the best path to take to reach our destination. Sarah, who was sitting in the front passenger seat, looked at the map that she had spread out, her finger tracing the various roads they could take. Alright folks, we got a couple of options here. The main road will take us through the heart of the forest, but this secondary road might offer a more scenic journey. Before venturing into the wooded pines of Utah, we stopped by one of the local forest offices to gather information. Google and iPhones couldn't always be relied upon in these remote areas, so Sarah had purchased a detailed local paper map. She was always the one planning every trip down in detail. I know we're used to having technology guide us, but out here, it's best to rely on good old-fashioned paper, she said, holding up the map with a grin. Mike, who was sitting behind me, leaned ahead, squinting at the map. Scenic is good, but how well maintained is that secondary road? The last thing we want is to get stuck out here in the middle of nowhere. Well, the map does say it's a bit longer, but it looks like it leads through some interesting landmarks. There's an old bridge marked here, and it seems like a more direct path to the campsite, Sarah said. Luke, who was sitting in the far back, raised an eyebrow with a grin. An old bridge, huh? Are we talking wooden planks, or Indiana Jones style adventure? Jennifer laughed. Let's hope it's somewhere in between. I'm all for adventure, but I'd rather not end up in a river. Leo, as the driver, what do you think? Sarah asked me. Well, seeing that we still have sunlight on our side, I say we take the scenic road. I mean, what's the rush, right? I vote for the old bridge. I'm gonna say the old bridge as well. Why don't we take a vote? Emily said. Everyone raised their hand except Mike. Sorry, Mike. Maybe next time you'll win, Sarah said. A decision had been reached. The secondary road, with its promise of scenic beauty. I veered onto the road, the wilderness and trees closing in. The path was narrow, flanked by dense woods that only gave way to small rays of the sunlight. After hours had passed and the sun began to set, we found ourselves coming across the bridge that spanned the river, the water reflecting the fading light, a contrast to the woods that lay ahead. It looks like this is the old bridge Sarah mentioned, Mike remarked, as I slowed down the van. Sarah peered out of the window, her eyes scanning the bridge. It definitely has that rustic charm, but I hope it's sturdy enough to support the van. Luke's grin returned as he leaned, his excitement evident. Well, there's only one way to find out. Jennifer laughed. Alright, but if we end up in the river, Luke, you're swimming back to the campsite. I'm not gonna lie, I was nervous. The bridge looked like it was a mixture of concrete and wood. What if we didn't make it? When was the last time this bridge was used? I eased the van slowly onto the creaky bridge, not even knowing what the point of driving slowly was, because if it was to break, it was gonna break. The worn planks made noises beneath the weight of the van, as the river flowed gently below. I looked in the rearview mirror to see everyone's scared faces as we crossed, still maintaining my eyes on the road back and forth. I saw Emily's eyes as she gazed out the water below. This is something like an adventure out of a movie, isn't it? I'm expecting to see hidden treasure on the banks, she said. Mike chuckled, his grip steady on one of the handlebars. Yeah, you're right. We're gonna find out what adventure this is if we end up falling, because you all decided to come through this raggedy bridge. Mike was always the more serious one, but courageous in the group. He always took challenges head on, and nothing ever seemed to scare him. Luke was the joker of the group. His sense of humor was always there, even in the most serious moments. Sarah, on the other hand, was our friend who was the most caring of the group. As I said, she always assumed the role of our mom, always making sure everything is planned to the detail. Emily was just silly all around. She was a close friend of all of us, that we simply enjoyed her company. She was the most serious female of the group, but didn't have the seriousness of Mike. Well, if that even makes sense. We ended up making it across the bridge, which I do want to point out, it's not even a long bridge. It simply looked like a small construction bridge, that someone built to be able to get across. As the sun started going down, we continued driving with the trees closing in around us even more, almost creating what looked like a tunnel, with the headlights of the van being the only source now piercing the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached our destination, a dirt open field that looked like where vehicles had parked in the past. Tall pine trees stood around the field, forming a natural dome that seemed to welcome us from the outside world. "Alright everyone, this is it," I said as I parked the van and stepped out, the air carrying a smell that hinted at the adventures that awaited us. There was a small stream nearby, its gentle flowing of water adding to the nature that surrounded us. We unloaded everything and we walked a little bit deeper into the woods until we stumbled upon a clearing not too far from where we had parked. We began the process of setting up camp, pitching tents, arranging firewood, and establishing a central gathering point where the campfire would soon be set ablaze. As the sun finished dipping below the horizon, casting the area in complete darkness, the tent stood up and the campfire pit awaited. We were all fascinated by the beauty of this place, away from the busyness and the stresses of every day in our life. So the first night there started fine, but as the campfire flames flicker in the breeze, we huddle around the fire, sharing stories and laughing, with a sense of security over us, just because of the presence of each other. With the trees casting long shadows over our campsite, and the branches creaking softly in the night wind, our voices would rise and fall as we took turns recounting past stories and adventures. We talked the normal things when you hang out with friends and family, the same old stories from the past. "Hey, remember that time Luke tripped over his own shoelaces and didn't have anything else to wear?" Emily giggled, making fun of Luke. He chuckled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, I remember. And I'm still gonna say that the tree root came out of nowhere." Jennifer leaned in. "Or what about that haunted house we dared each other to explore? I'm pretty sure we all had nightmares for weeks after that." Sarah with a smirk. "Alright, but what about this, y'all? The time we heard those strange noises outside our tents during that camping trip in the mountains." Mike's face turned serious and said, "Man, I thought we were being surrounded by wild animals or something." "That's right, and then we found out it was just a bunch of raccoons having a party in the woods," I said. Of course, throughout this whole time, Emily couldn't say anything but laugh. The night continued on, and it was always a great time to gather with my friends, especially after not seeing them for so long. As we were telling and recounting past adventures, something caught my attention. I was looking over to Mike as he was talking, and for a quick glimpse, at the edge of the woods, where the firelight struggled to penetrate the darkness, there was movement, a flicker of shadow that seemed to move between the trees. I quickly stood up and focused with my head to look over towards the tree line as I exchanged glances with the others. "Did any of you see that?" I whispered. Luke turned to look where I was looking and squinted into the darkness. "What did you see? Maybe a deer or something?" "It moved kind of strange for a deer," I said. Jennifer leaned closer to the fire. "I hope you're not trying to pull a prank, Leo." As I looked deeper into the tree line, still trying to get my eyes adjusted from staring at the fire for too long, I saw that the movement in the trees and branches was getting closer. It was something, or someone. I kept staring out into the tree line. This movement was drawing closer, slowly becoming visible by the light the fire was giving out. And that's when I noticed a silhouette of a hunched figure. And I guess that's when Luke finally saw it, because he said, "It looks like a person." "Do you think it's someone lost in the woods?" Emily whispered. "I hope it's not someone who's hurt," Sarah said, with concern in her voice. Luke chuckled. "Well, if this person is hurt, they're sure moving better than I would be." "Who even goes wandering around the woods at this hour?" Emily said. At this point, all of us were standing, and that's when I decided to say, "Who's out there?" I yelled. Then, just as the silhouette became clear in the tree line, that's when a voice broke the silence. "Greetings, young ones," this person said in a voice that held both wisdom and innocence. Emerging from the trees, I saw it was an older man. "Forgive my intrusion. I spied the glow of your campfire from afar, and was drawn hoping it wasn't a wildfire that I would have to put out. This land, you see, holds a history long forgotten by many." His steps and his form, revealing his age not only in his slightly stooped posture, but also in the deep lines engraved on his face. It was as though he was an extension of the trees surrounding us. As he drew closer, the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the forest underscored the quiet intensity of the moment. Finally, he approached the campfire, revealing his full features as he introduced himself. "Pardon me, my name is Tog." His voice, very old and raspy, with one of his eyes semi-shut, scars and years of life showing on his face. I offer a friendly smile. "Hey, I'm Leo, and this is Luke, Sarah, Emily, Jennifer, and Mike. We didn't expect to have company out here. What brings you to these woods at this hour?" He stared at us with his one eye. "The woods have always been my refuge, my sanctuary, my safe place. I come here to remember the old ways, to honor the native land that sustained my ancestors." "Native land?" Jennifer questioned, her voice in a serious manner. The old man nodded, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Staring at them, he said, "Yes, this land was once home to my ancestors, and I have wandered these woods to honor their memory. But in all my years, it's very rare when I encounter fellow souls under these stars." Mike leaned in, with curiosity but in a serious tone. "So, what brought you here tonight?" With a faint smile, Tog said, "Your fire, as I said before. But then I heard the laughing that echoed through the trees. It reminded me of times in the past, where I shared, and bonds were forged around similar fires." "Are you telling us that you're camping out here too?" Emily asked. Tog's chuckle was like the rustling leaves themselves. "Well, not quite. My old bones prefer the comforts of a proper bed, but I do find peace in these woods, even under the cover of night." As the conversation flowed, Tog's words painted a picture of his relationship with the woods. The way he spoke, the stuff he was saying, seemed like he was one with the forest. "There is nothing like finding peace and comfort within your own self, in the beauty of nature. There are hidden trails that go through the forest, roads known only to those who have taken the time to listen to the whispers of the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every flowing stream, and every whisper of the wind carries echoes of the past." His voice full of reverence of the woods. "Listen, the ancient wisdom of this land has much to teach, if one is willing to listen." I'm not sure what it was, but the way he spoke and the way he looked seemed like he was just a hippie who loved the outdoors. Pretty harmless in my opinion. I took a step towards him and put my hand on his shoulder. Tog? Well, how do you spell your name?" I asked. "My name?" "Well, that's the first time that somebody has ever asked me how to spell it. As I mentioned, I have a native background, so it's spelled T-A-O-G. I figured that's how you spelled it. Just wanted to make sure. "Well, Tog, we're sharing stories ourselves, and it seems you have quite a few to tell. Would you care to join our campfire?" His eye glinted with appreciation. "I would be honored to, young man." As he settled into a log near the fire, and we all sat down, his presence seemed to infuse the night with a deeper sense of connection. He started telling stories of the hidden trails, the forgotten stories, and the ancient wisdom that whispered through the leaves, blending with the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the trees. He spoke not just of the past, but of the living spirit of the woods, a spirit that resonated with each of us as we gathered around the fire. As he delved into his stories and what seemed to be a TED talk on how we need to respect the woods and nature, he told us how he comes into the forest to spend seasons, to honor his spiritual ancestors, how he owns a few remote cabins, and has learned to be self-sufficient just like his ancestors. However, one specific story caught the attention of all of us. He told the story of a supposed creature that haunted these very woods for generations. Then, his voice took on a somber tone, and even the crackling fire seemed to be quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to listen.
The whispering goat,
He began, his words dripping with a mixture of reverence and dread,
is a creature of darkness, a shapeshifter that walks a fine line between man and beast. It has a twisted power, the ability to mimic the voices of those it encounters, drawing them into its trap.
As he detailed this supposed creature, our circle grew tense. I could see the eyes of everyone else that they were paying attention to this specific story. He then lowered his gaze, and his voice, almost a whisper, he said,
A few decades ago, my brother ventured into these woods, drawn by the whispers of familiar voices. As I was searching for him, I heard my own voice calling out to him, but it wasn't me. It was someone else calling out to him. That's when I think my brother believed he was responding to my call, but it was the whispering goat's deceit, and so he never returned, and I never found him. His fate, shrouded in mystery. I have carried the weight of that loss ever since, haunted by the knowledge that he may have fallen prey to the whispering goat.
A shiver crept down my spine as we all listened. When he concluded his tale, there was silence. Even the fire seemed to have absorbed the weight of his story as it started to go down. With a slow and crippled movement struggling to get up, he rose from his seat, his eye meeting each of ours in turn.
I thank you all for allowing an old man to share his stories with you. But the night grows old, and it's time for me to return to the embrace of these ancient trees,
he said in a voice that contained gratitude and sorrow. As he stepped away from the fire, he turned around and said,
I almost forgot. Stay close,
he said in a warning voice,
and do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know.
The darkness seemed to cover him as he walked away, making him one with the shadows of the woods. It's almost like he was part of this landscape. We watched in silence as he receded into the darkness, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even the noises of the forest seemed to hold its breath, a quiet reverence for the figure that had imparted both wisdom and a warning. And as the echoes of his footsteps crunching the leaves faded, the woods returned to their symphony of rustling leaves and distant whispers. A heavy silence fell within our group. Well, what the fuck was all that about? This hippie love-making tree hugger most likely has his tent somewhere out there and lives out here in the woods, Luke said. We tried shaking off the feeling, but I could tell that anxiety had filled everyone, thanks to the power of a supposed well-told ghost story. But as the night deepened, the campfire had dwindled to embers, and a thick blanket of darkness fell over the campsite. I do want to point out that whenever we went camping, we always either slept inside a tent or outside altogether by the campfire. I guess nothing like actually experiencing the beauty of nature. Tonight, we decided to all sleep in our sleeping bags around the dying campfire, as the events of the evening and the stories still linger in our heads. We all decided to go to sleep, and as I was falling asleep, in the dead of the night, that's when I heard it, a whisper that seemed to move through the air. It was a voice, soft and insistent, calling my name. Leo. I fully woke up. I sat up in my sleeping bag, with my senses on high alert. My eyes widened, scanning the darkness and everyone else laying down, the faint glimmer of dying embers offering little comfort. Did anybody hear that? I whispered, hoping to see if anyone around me was awake and heard. Mike, who was sleeping next to me, sat up and said in a groggy voice, hear what? Someone whispered my name. It sounded like you, Mike. Mike's expression shifted from grogginess to a growing sense of unease. That's not possible, Mike said, his eyes flickering to the dark woods that surrounded them. I was asleep? Jennifer then arose with a voice of mixture. Are you sure you didn't dream it, Leo? I know that we're all on edge after the story told by Toad. I haven't even gone to sleep. Every noise out here is making me stay awake. I know what I heard. It was right here in the camp, I said. Man, go to sleep, bro. You're hearing things now. Stop being such a wuss. There's nothing out here, Mike said. But then, just on the edge after Mike's last word, the faintest whisper, Leo. Everyone fell silent. The voice was real, undeniable, and it sounded like it was next to our campfire. We all looked to Mike. What? I didn't say anything, Mike said. Of course, it was complete darkness, so we couldn't even really see each other out there. So we all just huddled even closer with everyone else waking up groggy as well, and getting closer together too, seeking refuge in our shared presence. Okay, what's going on, y'all? I said. It's most likely that old Pawpaw trying to prank us. He's most likely out there with more people scaring campers, Mike said. Well, one of us should stand watch and just be on the lookout. It's already 4 a.m. and the sun will begin to rise in a few hours, I said. Of course, none of us ended up going back to sleep, and we all just stood awake with eyes wide open. The morning couldn't come soon enough. Seeing the daylight brought relief, but as we remember the night, others, including Luke, Sarah, and Emily, admitted hearing whispers as well, each in the voice of a different member of our group. We tried brushing it off as imagination, simply fueled by the stories that Toad was telling us last night. We got ready for the day, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shadows on the forest floor. Emily suggested that we take a hike along one of the nearby trails that's on the map. Maybe some fresh air and a change of scenery will help us relax, she said, her voice trying to sound hopeful. Mike and Luke exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity. I guess it wouldn't hurt to explore a bit. I'm sure it was that old man whispering our names out from the trees last night. If I find him, once we go out there, he's really gonna be looking like an old dead beat up tree. Thanks to stupid Leo for telling him our names, Mike said. Sorry guys, I seriously thought he was just an old hermit walking through, I chuckled. There have been times in the past when we became friends with other campers in our annual trips, and we all shared names, even phone numbers, to communicate in the future, so I actually didn't think too much of it. We set off on the trail, our footsteps breaking the silence of the woods, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in patches of gold. As we walked, our conversation gradually shifted from the events of the previous night to lighter topics, remembering old camping trips, sharing funny stories, and debating the best way to make s'mores. It was almost like the woods were allowing us a moment of peace, a chance to reconnect and find comfort in each other's company. Hours passed, and we eventually found ourselves in a small clearing by a small stream. The sun was beginning its descent. We took a break, sitting by the water's edge, dipping our fingers in the cool stream. Check this out, y'all, Luke said, his voice with a mixture of excitement. He pointed to the tree where patterns had been carved into the bark. Sarah stepped closer, her fingers tracing the carvings with a sense of wonder. "It's like a message left behind," she said as her eyes traced the lines. As we looked around more, we discovered other things. Small artifacts hanging from branches, crafted from natural materials, by sticks and stones, and even with symbols painted onto the stones. "Hey, it's like the woods are trying to tell us something similar to what Togue said," Emily slightly giggled. Mike raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe it's just people messing around in the woods. You know, leaving their mark." Luke nodded in agreement. "And branches crafted into what looks like symbols. They could be signs that they communicated like this back in the day." I guess the stories that Togue was sharing with us last night really did prove that we were in the midst of Native American land, and all these symbols and sticks and stones we found only reinforced that belief. Who knows? We might be standing on ground that's witnessed generations. Maybe these woods have secrets that date back centuries, Jennifer said. "Look guys, I get that this all seems interesting and everything, but let's not forget that we've been on these trips every year, and every time there's some sort of spooky tale or mysterious superstition that pops up. Remember the haunted lake we stumbled upon 2 years ago?" Mike said. Emily chuckled, her eyes with amusement. "The one with the vengeful water spirit that would drag people under if they swam too far out?" Mike with a grin. "Exactly. And what did we find? A perfectly serene lake where we spent a whole day swimming and goofing off." Luke chimed in. "And don't forget the enchanted forest last year, where we were told that we would get lost if we ventured too far into the deep woods." Jennifer, with a laughing tone, said, "Right, we found a trail with signs pointing us to various landmarks." Sarah joined in. "And let's not even talk about the cursed campground, where they said that we would have to ward off evil spirits to make it through the night." As everybody was laughing, Mike nodded, his point emphasized. "See y'all, it's always been a bit of fun and games, fueled by local legends. I'm not saying I don't appreciate the spooky environments, especially by the campfire, but come on y'all, this is just the same old stuff we have encountered before." Emily grinned in a sarcastic and playful tone. "So you're telling us you don't believe in any of this? Not even a tiny bit?" Mike shrugged. "I'm not saying I'm a complete non-believer, but I do think a lot of people exaggerate. Like, what are the odds that we stumble upon some mystical artifacts on this trip, right? Or a whispering goat?" Luke raised his eyebrows and said, "Maybe the woods are trying to prove you wrong, Mike." The back and forth continued with everybody, as Mike reminded us that we were all friends who had been through it all before. As the day transitioned into evening, we made our way back to the campsite. The sinking sun painted the sky orange and pink. We couldn't ignore the fact that another night was approaching, a night that, given recent events, filled us with a mix of anticipation and dread. Back at the campsite, we set up and got dinner ready. The campfire crackled to life, with its flames dancing, and the forest too seemed to come alive with the chorus of all the critters starting to make noises. As darkness settled over the campsite, we gathered around the campfire once again. The events of the previous nights were still fresh in our minds. As the evening went on, a thick fog started to surround the entire campsite, and as our campfire struggled, its light barely puncturing the fog, Mike, always the brave one, volunteered to gather more firewood. He ventured out into the mist, his flashlight beam gradually merging with the surroundings. This is when everything went to hell. As the fog started getting more thick, and it was getting even more darker, we realized that Mike had been gone for a while. The minutes felt like hours. We exchanged glances. "He's been gone for quite a while, y'all. Shouldn't he have been back by now?" Emily said with a concerned voice. "Maybe he got lost in the fog. One of us should have gone with him," Luke said. Jennifer's eyes were wide. "What if he's hurt?" What if he encounters something out there? After about 30 minutes, the environment grew heavy. The campfire's embers started to sputter. The fog had taken on an almost suffocating presence. Maybe we should go find him. We can't just wait here in the dark, Sarah said. And that's when I decided to get up. And I said, I'll go look for him. I mean, how far can he be, right? I took about 2 steps the way Mike had left. And that's when I saw a figure emerging through the fog. It was Mike. And he was coming back with firewood. Except the way he was walking was very dull. As he approached the campfire, his movements were mechanical, almost as if he was in a trance. Sarah, always the one to confront difficult situations, broke the silence. Did you get lost or something? He turned to look at her. I'm fine. I found firewood. The unease in the air deepened, each of us sensing that something was wrong. Mike's presence fell off. It was as if a shadow had draped itself over his being, distorting his familiar features. His whole demeanor was replaced by an emotionless state. I couldn't help but notice something strange about Mike. He was sitting slightly apart from the group, staring directly at the flames, not even saying anything. I was thinking he was just tired or scared, so I tried to engage him in conversation. Hey Mike, remember that one time we got lost and had to spend an extra night out? But he didn't respond. Well, he did, but his response was delayed. And when he did answer, his tone was off. It lacked the seriousness I was used to. It was almost like he was hearing us talk, but responding to questions a moment too late. You mean when we thought the squirrels were plotting against us? Luke chimed in, trying to break the growing tension. Yeah, that's right. And you were convinced that the woods had eyes and ears. Mike's laugh, if you could even call it that, sounded forced. A hollow echo, you can say. Yeah, good times, he replied, his gaze distant. Emily leaned ahead with a concerned voice. Hey, Mike, are you okay? You're acting different. Mike then looked at her. I'm not sure. Something about this place. It's like it's under my skin. Jennifer's voice held a note of unease. Weird things have been happening tonight. The voices, the fog. I think we should consider leaving. Mike's gaze remained fixed on the flames. His voice almost lowered to a whisper. Maybe that's not a bad idea. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. We exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of the strange things happening, now impossible to ignore. I looked around at my friends, each face reflecting a mix of fear. It was a painful realization that the place that had once been our escape was now a source of unease. Well, we should leave. Something isn't right here, I said. Nods of agreement followed, the decision being unanimous this time. The prospect of abandoning our camping trip was sad, but the safety of our group came first, and so we started packing everything. It took about 30 minutes to break everything down, and by then, it was now completely dark. However, as we finished packing our gear and glanced around to make sure everything was ready, a sinking feeling settled in our stomachs. Mike, who had been acting distant and detached, was just standing by the edge of the clearing, staring into the depths of the woods. Unlike the rest of us, he hadn't lifted a finger to help with the packing, and his usual seriousness and energetic self replaced by an almost trance-like state. Hey Mike, are you alright, man? I said with a concerned tone. Mike's response was slow and distant, as though his mind was somewhere far away. Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking. Jennifer, exchanging a worried look with all of us. It was clear that something had changed in Mike. As we started getting ready to walk from the campfire back to the van, that's when we heard it. Somewhere in the distance, we heard another voice. It sounded like Mike's voice, and it was calling out, sounding confused and pleading for help. And that's when Emily said, "So if that's Mike calling out to us, then who is?" As we turned around, Mike was still staring into the woods, but that's when his body started contorting, almost glitching like. Chaos erupted. Jennifer, always quick thinking, threw a log towards this Mike that was standing on the edge of the campsite and yelled everyone to run back to the van. Guided by adrenaline and our flashlights, we dashed through the woods. As we all ran with our belongings, I dared to not look back. But still, a horrible screech drew my attention back to see what had caused this. And that's when I stopped in my tracks to see that whatever this thing was now had its limbs stretched and twisted, reshaping into something that defied the laws of nature. But it was the face that sent a shockwave of terror through me. The human features contorted and elongated, the skin stretching and warping as if it was struggling to contain the monstrosity beneath. The eyes, once familiar and warm, became stretched out and unnaturally slanted, their color shifting to an abyss-like blackness that seemed to absorb all light. The nose receded that resembled the snout of a goat. The mouth was a grotesque smile, its lips curling back to reveal rows of jagged, pointed teeth. Every detail was a horrifying mixture of human and animal. That's when I felt my body come back to life, and I yelled to keep running and to not look back, not knowing that even if they got to the van, how would they even get inside because I had the key? I kept running and running, thinking what would happen if this thing caught up to us. And then, there, in the distance, I saw the clearing of the trees and familiar sight of the van, and heard my friends screaming to hurry up. As I neared the van, I saw that the real Mike, with his clothes torn, was there with the rest of the group. With no time to lose, we crammed into the van and sped off. As I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw this creature standing where we had parked at. After about 5 minutes of driving, Luke finally spoke and said, "What the fuck was that?" That's when Mike finally spoke and said, "When I ventured into the woods, the fog seemed to grow denser with each step I was taking. Soon, my flashlight was the only thing piercing the gloom. I had collected some firewood when I heard whispers. I heard y'all's voices calling out to me. I tried tracing them but got lost. Then, I saw me, or a copy of me. It looked like my reflection in a murky pond." Mike then stopped talking, struggling to find the words. This other me was trying to draw me closer, with words and voices that belonged to you all. That's when I decided to hide behind a tree, using the shadows as cover, and every time I tried to make a move towards the camp, it seemed to sense me, always blocking my path. I thought I was done for, but then I remember a stream we crossed earlier. That's when I made a dash for it and jumped in. The flow carried me downstream, away from that thing. I crawled out, exhausted, and walked towards the van. That's when I started yelling for you all, and that's when you all came running from the forest. As we were speeding away, all the trees were whipping past us, their branches scratching the sides of my van, almost like desperate fingers trying to pull us back. Over the noise of the engine and the pounding of my heart, that's when we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere, all at once. As I kept my eyes on the road, the headlights briefly illuminated a monstrous form darting between the trees. The creature was a horrible version of a goat, but massive in scale, murky gray, almost appearing slick in the dim light, with ragged scars and patches of bare skin. Its eyes, though, were the most terrifying. Deep, soulless pits of black. "What the hell is that?" screamed Emily, clutching her seat. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor. With the van's engine roaring, the creature, with an incredible speed, moved through the dense forest, its every leap and bound bringing it closer to us. As we went through a sharp bend, this thing lunged, its massive jaws snapping inches from the rear window. Luke, who was in the back seat, rummaged through our camping supplies and hurled a flare out the window. It lit up the surrounding area in a bright crimson glow, distracting the creature for a few seconds. I continued speeding, tires screeching, and for a moment, it seemed we had lost it. But then, a screeching noise that echoed through the woods. The creature resumed its relentless pursuit, its form now even more twisted and grotesque under the flickering light of the flare. The road ahead clear, revealing the bridge we had crossed earlier. Realizing this might be our only chance, Sarah shouted, "Get across the bridge, now!" We barreled into the bridge, the van shaking under the strained boards. As we reached the halfway point, a deafening roar filled the air. Looking back, we saw the creature stop at the bridge's edge, with what looked to be an evil smirk, an image that still haunts me to this day. I'll even provide a drawing at the end if anybody wants to see it. After a few hours of driving, we finally left the woods and found the safety of the dim-lit streets of a nearby town. We pulled into a Waffle House, and we sat in a corner booth as we recounted the evening's events, trying to make sense of it all. Jennifer, her hands wrapped around her mug. "That old man, Togue," she began. "He knew too much about the whispering goat. Don't you think? There was agreement between us." I started rubbing my head and responded, "It's not just that he knew about it. Remember how he just appeared out of nowhere? And how, after he left, things immediately took a turn for the worse." The eyes of Sarah widened, and the way he emphasized not to trust familiar voices, almost like he was setting us up, giving us a clue about the thing we were about to face. Mike, looking more pale than usual, added, "When I was in the woods, trying to escape that thing, I heard more than our voices. I swear, I heard the voice of that old man calling me, trying to draw me in. I think he might have been the whispering goat himself." We all exchanged glances. The thought was too horrific to fully grasp. Had this creature taken on the look of an old man to toy with us, to get close, to study us? But why would he warn us about himself? It doesn't make sense, I said. Unless he enjoys the chase, the fear. Maybe for an old creature, the hunting is more thrilling, Luke said. We all sat in heavy silence, pondering the possibility as we pieced it all together. The sudden appearance of Togue, his detailed stories, and the hunting events. The conclusion became clear. The old man, with deep-set wrinkles and tales of old, had likely been the whispering goat himself. That happened a few months ago, and the trauma still lingers. First up was when we lost touch with Mike, who moved to another state, I guess to escape the memories. From that moment on, everything else changed. The once tight bonds between us frayed. Our group chats grew quiet, and any future gathering ceased. And the annual camping trip became nothing more than a distant memory. The haunting echoes of that night lingered, and every rustling of leaves, every faint whisper, served as a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the woods. The memory of the whispering goat and twisted grin haunted my dreams. A constant replay of the terror that unfolded before us. The mere thought of venturing into the wilderness sent shivers down my spine, a sensation of impending doom that I couldn't shake. As time passed, the memory of that horrifying encounter began to fade. We did all end up going separate ways, and I found methods to cope with the nightmares I experienced afterwards. I even went and talked with a counselor because every corner that I looked, every voice I heard, at night when I was falling asleep, I swear, I would sometimes hear those faint whispers. Last night, I was walking alone in a park near my apartment. The sun had set, and the moon was shining bright. I quickened my pace as the nighttime brought back episodes and bad memories of the night in the forest. With my heart racing as the memories of that night flooded back, that's when I heard it. A faint distant sound that sent shivers down my spine. Whispers, soft, as if carried by the wind itself. I stopped in my tracks, straining to make out the words, feeling a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I heard my name, Leo. My heart raced, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, and the whispering seemed to grow near. And then, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, much like the one we had heard that night in the woods. Fear flooded my veins, and I finally tore my gaze away from the darkness, fleeing from the park as if my life depended on it, which at this point it most likely did. The whispers and the noises seemed to chase me, echoing in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I locked every door and window, heart pounding like a drum. I tried to rationalize what happened, telling myself it was all in my head, anxiety, and a product of what happened in the past in the woods. But deep down, I knew it was the whispering goat. As the night continued, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something evil lurked just beyond my vision. And just as I was about to close my eyes that night to try to sleep, I heard it again, the whispers, closer now, almost like a soft breath against my ear. Leo, Leo. My blood turned to ice, and I clutched my cover. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure, its eyes reflecting the dim light like deep, soulless pits. The figure's mouth opened, and it spoke, its voice using all of my friends' voices, distorted and nightmarish.
We missed you, Leo.
With my eyes never leaving the figure, with trembling hands, I rushed to the front door, my heart pounding so loud that I couldn't even hear anything else. And then, just as I reached past the door, I heard one last whisper, faint but unmistakable. Run. I bursted out the house, leaving everything behind. I got inside my old trusted van and sped away to my parents' house, who lived about 2 hours away. And I never went back again. It's almost midnight. I'm at my parents' house, and here I am, sharing and writing this to you all, in the hopes to warn you. Everything is real. It's not in my head, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows, whispering its haunting lullaby. Those moments when you second guess a distant call your name, when you are alone at home tonight, in bed, falling asleep.
Do not be swayed by the voices that you think you know.